Our topic for today is pedagogy and ethics. We're going to start with some scenarios. Number one, a student comes to you, you're the professor, offers you a considerable amount of money in order to get a better grade on an exam. Scenario number two, extra credit. We all know what happens here. Some student chokes on the final exam and comes pleading for the chance to take the exam again or to do anything that I possibly can to raise my grade. Scenario number three, a little bit different situation. In this case, you recognize that there's a student who's been working very hard and you expect her to do very well in the exam, but she fails it. Those are our three scenarios. Now let's talk about ethics. Ethical standards. I'm using this term to mean this. Commonly used policies and procedures intended to assist us in carrying out the responsibilities of the various people and groups with which we interact. In teaching, those various people and groups are students. Let's talk about then this relationship between ethics and teaching. But we're going to notice that rather than me giving you some factual statements, I'm going to really be forced to answer a bunch of questions. Is ethics in teaching, is it about right versus wrong? Is it about cultural norms such as promise keeping or honesty or individualism or collectivism or whatever the cultural norm may be? Or is it a set of general guidelines to direct one's teaching? However we answer these questions, we're going to be faced with ethical challenges. I'm going to just mention a couple. First one is an ethical violation. This is when we are tempted to act contrary to those ethical standards we have, those policies and procedures. We don't want to actually have to enforce them. But if we do, if we're forced to, that's a violation. The other one is ethical dilemma. This is when multiple responsibilities conflict or have more than one right answer. What kind of actions do we take? The first scenario pretty much clearly is going to be an ethical violation. No matter what kind of policies and procedures you have, it's got to be a violation. If not, then you're in the wrong profession. The second scenario is not quite as straightforward. We have to ask ourselves a couple questions here. The first one is, should a student be allowed opportunities not available to other students? Second question, is providing a student a retake unethical, or is it just unfair, or is there a difference between unethical and being unfair? The third scenario presents another interesting problem for us. Should our assessment counter the performance? She didn't do very well on the test, but gosh, she's been working so hard. So are there boundaries for our help? We can offer students help, but how far do we go with it? Let's look at some guidelines for reflecting on one's ethicality in teaching. That's a good word to use, ethicality. Makes you sound like you're smart. First one is autonomy. This would be the freedom from external control or influence. You want students to have independence, right? So the question then you ask yourself is, am I treating others as autonomous beings and respecting their freedom? Do we move on to non-malfeasance? This is another standard ethical question. Am I omitting or am I including issues that may cause harm when I'm in my teaching? Am I guilty of acts of omission or acts of commission? Next is beneficence. The question there is, who's really benefiting from my actions? Is it me or is it the student? And then we have justice. Do I really treat the students fairly? And then we have fidelity. And fidelity for teaching is, am I being faithful to my obligations as an instructor? Now, in a second, I'm going to talk about those obligations. Another thing we need to reflect on is our mindfulness. Am I aware of my own presuppositions? And are they efficacious? Am I getting things done? Am I actually aware of what I'm saying? And is what I'm saying valid? Okay, so what are these responsibilities we have to the students? There's a few of them here. First one is encourage learning. This is what teaching is all about. You're supposed to be about teaching the students how to learn. If you don't have that in your policies, then again, you're in the wrong profession. Always make sure you are prepared for class. That's an ethical obligation. Now, remember, these are guidelines I'm giving, and I'm giving you my point of view here. Keep that in mind. These are my guidelines that I'm telling you, that I'm trying to teach you. Always make sure you are prepared for class. This is the number one complaint that I get as a chair of a department from students about faculty members. They are not prepared for class. And there's no excuse for this. If nothing else, you got to be prepared. You also need to make sure that you're current in the field, that what you're talking about is the latest that you possibly can be talking about. And you want to encourage autonomous investigation of the course content. That's why you give assignments. You don't just want the students to come in to class and listen to you. You want them to do something else with the material that you're talking about in class. You got to encourage them to go out and do more investigation on that content. Encourage learning. You got to respect the students as you're doing this. First thing I say about this is that you need to forewarn students if you're going to be talking about a sensitive topic in class. It's only fair. It's respectful. You don't want them to get blindsided by some topic that is very sensitive. Also, you want to make sure that you separate your opinion from fact and that students know the difference. And what I'm trying to do right now is give you some guidelines, and I'm giving you some biased guidelines. These are the ones that I think you should follow. You may disagree, and that's fine. You can disagree. It didn't make a difference as long as you have some. Separate the fact from the opinion. And with these ethical standards, keep in mind, there are no facts. This is an individual call. That's one of the things that's going to distinguish this from other things you're going to study. Be available outside the classroom to discuss with students things that you talk about in the classroom, because sometimes they want to know more. That is part of encouraging the learning, but also respecting them and their time and their motivation. You got to respect that. Next is to honor confidentiality. Sometimes when you give assignments, students write things, they say things about themselves that they really don't want broadcast. So if students self-disclose to you, remember they have a right to privacy. Now you do have to ask yourself, when should I discuss a student's situation with somebody else? If the student is disclosing things to me about maybe some things going on at home, or maybe some things that have gone on campus, or whatever the issue is there a point where you as the instructor have to make a decision of when can I go and talk about this to somebody else? Another thing is you need to be a model for the students. And by that I mean you go beyond the content, be a thinking person. What you're going to do is you're going to show them how to think about these concepts. You don't necessarily have to show them what to think. You want to show them how to think about the concepts. To be a thinking person. And they're going to watch you. They're going to see how you deal with these issues. So you need to demonstrate how to think through your own actions. Keep this in mind. Most of the professors that you have never took a class in how to teach. Probably 90% of, 95% of maybe, and never took a class in how to teach. Whatever they teach, they never took a class in how to teach. So what are they doing? They're using the models that they saw when they were in class. They are using the professors they had as their models. So you never know how far your reach might be when you're teaching. Okay, next, you evaluate the performance honestly and fairly. How important is it that everyone be evaluated the same way? Now let's think about our scenario number 2. The student who wants the extra credit. How important is it that you give the same opportunity to everybody? Maybe there's a reason that you would give to this student. But you have to ask yourself, how important is it that I evaluate everybody the same way? In doing this, you're going to ask yourself, is it fair to maintain uniform standards across contexts, or to use individual standards according to each student's situation? That's really one of the key questions you're going to have as you deal with students. Okay, finally, the last thing. Avoid exploitation. What you need to do is remember that you are in a relationship where you have the power. Professor has a relationship with the student. It's a superior-subordinate relationship. The teacher, professor, instructor is in charge. You want to make sure that you don't exploit that relationship in any unfair way. You can imagine all the ways you might be able to do that. Be mindful of the sexual, religious, and racial discriminations that you might be guilty of if you're not careful of how you word things and say things. You have to be very careful not to sort of show your hand, as it were. And don't exploit students based on any of these criteria. And finally, is you receiving any special consideration because of your position? Sometimes because you're a professor, you're going to get special treatment, and that is a no-no. The student may invite you to a dinner to butter you up. This is no different than scenario number 1. He's paying you off. Keep that in mind. That's the end of the show.